Okay, thank you everybody for joining tonight again. We are continuing our shiur on tefillah, and we are up to the Berachot HaShachar. Last week we studied the Beracha of Netilat Yadayim, and we discussed the history of Netilat Yadayim and how it was originally instituted, most likely, as a bracha to ward off either ruach ra'ah, a spiritual evil, or even a possibly just a bracha for hygiene, which turned into a bracha that was designed to ward off evil spirits. Whatever it was, that was our exploration last week. And this week, we're continuing in the Siddur itself, at least with the order. If you open a Siddur, what is it actually going to say in it? And we're continuing with Asher Yatzar. So Asher Yatzar is, I'm going to share my screen here. Asher Yatzar is, of course, one of the most well-known brachos that Jewish people say. Jewish people famously say a bracha for absolutely everything, and even going to the bathroom. We're going to discuss tonight the sources of Asher Yatzar. We're going to take a trip through the development, the history, and so much more about Asher Yatzar. So I'm excited to begin. So let's begin just for fun. I'm going to begin with one of my favorite pet peeves, which is these signs that they have in shuls for Asher Yatzar. When I was a kid, they had this one here, and if you're listening in the audio, you could switch to Spotify video, so you could watch the presentation with us along, or you could move over to YouTube if you're watching this post facto. There's also a channel called Tefillah Unpacked where you can watch the presentation. But when I was a kid, these were the one on the left. These were the Asher Yatzar signs which dominated schools and shuls. And today, the Jaffa family here on East 24th Street in Flatbush, they sponsor all of these Asher Yatzar signs, and they're nice. You know what I mean? They're there to give people a translation of Asher Yatzar, or to make it pretty on the wall. And here with the kids, there's this whole fascinating thing where a cardboard man turns into a baby, and then he turns into an old man, and then he dies of a heart attack. It's fascinating artwork, and it's lots of fun. But the message that they write on these signs, this is just irks me to this day, is that they put here Asher Yatzar, which is beautiful, but if you actually look at them closely and read what they say, they bring this from the Seder Hayom, from Rabbi Moshe ibn Mechir. Imivarech brachazu bekavana. If a person says the bracha of Asher Yatzar with kavana, lo yechle kol yamav, he will never get sick. V'lo yitzarech lerofeh v'lo letrufotav, and he will never need a doctor nor his remedies. What a powerful, beautiful segula from Rabbi Moshe ibn Mechir. This is a beautiful thing, that a person should have kavana when he says Asher Yatzar, and if he would do so, he would never need a doctor nor his remedies. A powerful message, unfortunately, and the reason this is my pet peeve is that this is flatly not true. Rabbi Moshe ben Mechir doesn't only never give such a segula, even though he's like mikubal, he literally says the opposite. If you look it up, if you look up the Sefer Seder Yom itself, read what he says. He says that a person should have kavanah for this bracha because the body is so wondrous, but then he ends off, V'im ha'adam yesh shalem b'deotav. If a person is intelligent, u'mechalkel b'mishpat varav, and he eats in a with proper portions, lo yechalek kol yamav lo yitzarech l'rofeh v'lo l'refotav. If a person eats properly and he's intelligent about his health, he will never get sick, and he will never need a doctor, and he will never need his remedies. So this is one of my pet peeves, that they all quote the Seder Hayom as saying that the Asher Yatzar is some sort of segula. It's a magic bullet. All you got to do is say Asher Yatzar, and that's going to keep you from getting sick your entire life. Now, this is, in a way, a nice introduction to understanding the beauty of Asher Yatzar itself. This is a really beautiful bracha, and yes, having brachos does give us saying brachos does give us a spiritual bracha. If you say a bracha, it's going to bring you down a spiritual bracha. And Asher Yatzar is one of those beautiful brachot which has always been so meaningful to the Jewish people, how we meditate on our health, and God forbid on our unhealth, and we try not to take for granted the wonders and the mind-boggling mechanics of our bodies. And furthermore, Many rabbis have spoken about Asher Yatzar in pastoral terms, and that's a fancy word. Pastoral is a word for when a clergy, a rabbi, a priest is acting in a supportive manner for somebody in distress, somebody sick, somebody suffering. If a rabbi is acting in the capacity of a chaplain, the Beracha of Asher Yatzar is a great bracha to teach because it has so many beautiful messages to teach people regarding their health and the gratitude we have to Hashem for when we are healthy. However, this thing that Moshe ben Mechir never said, that saying Asher Yatzar magically is not a pastoral quality of Asher Yatzar whatsoever. Never, if you're a chaplain, never ever tell people segulas. Just stand there and listen, stand there and be there. Do not tell people segulas like this, especially if they're so egregiously not true. Okay, so now let's get to Asher Yatzar itself. Let's get back to its source. We're going to examine its parallels, and crucially, we're going to find its true messages before we dabble in the many trillion homiletics that have appeared in Svarim and on Asher Yatzar signs all over the world. So let's see the Gemara itself. Conveniently for us, the Gemara starts right at the top of Daf Samach Amud Bet in Berachot, and on my screen here we have the Gemara, which starts very simply. But before we start, this hanichnas lebet hakisei, a person who enters a bet hakisei, I should point out that starting the Gemara here is only gives you half the story, because what the Gemara is doing here on Daf Samach Amud Bet is it's continuing on a series of many different brachot, which I'm sorry, I'm just checking the chat. The Gemara here is continuing when the Mishnah said a person who enters a city should say a special prayer formula, and when he leaves the city safely, he should say another special prayer formula. Why? Because before you enter a city, it's dangerous. It's a new city. There's dangers involved to get in. There's dangers involved to get out. So the Mishnah prescribes certain prayer formulas for entering a city and leaving a city. So the Gemara then brings a set of braitot or amorac sayings that also similarly give you a bracha for when you enter something and when you leave. For example, when you enter a Beit HaMerchatz, when you leave a Beit HaMerchatz, when you enter a doctor's office, when you leave a doctor's office, when you enter the bathroom and when you leave the bathroom. So all of those cases were talking about where you enter a place of danger and then you leave a place of danger successfully and safely. It appears, for people who learn Gemaras a lot, that the Gemara is adding Asher Yatzar here, not because it's identical to the cases before it. It's not like entering a bathroom is considered a place of danger, simply because the Gemara often structures itself mnemonically or mnemotechnically in a way that's easy to memorize. Therefore, the Gemara is bringing a case which is similar in structure. Hanichnas lebet hakisei yomar, v'hayotzei yomar. Typically, the braitot are structured in that order because even though it's not a perfect parallel to the braitot before it, it's not a place you're entering of danger and leaving in danger. Still, it's brought in this series because it is similar enough mnemotechnically. It's similar enough in a way to memorize it. Also, as we're going to see, Asher Yatzar is first a prayer to angels, and then when you leave, it's a prayer to God. It's not both a prayer to God. So this is just something I'm pointing out about the structure, because the structure of Asher Yatzar here is a little awkward in the setting of the Gemara. It's just a little awkward and out of place. Some scholars wanted to read this a little strangely, that the whole bracha of Asher Yatzar is a threshold experience. Like in anthropology, there's a threshold ritual, a transition ritual, because they felt like they were going to a place of danger. I don't buy into that, simply because I have experience learning enough Gemaras that I simply don't see that kind of transition ritual or anxiety ritual that they're seeing. But that's everything you're going to see before the staff if you would have turned the page to Samach Amud Aleph. Conveniently for us, this page here is very simple. So let's read the Gemara together. Hanichnas lebeis hakisei Omar hischabdu mechubadim kidoshim meshartei elyon tenu kavod lelokei Yisrael. Right. So he's speaking to his ministering angels that accompany him. The Gemara understands that each person has guardian angels. This is something the Gemara takes for granted, that each person has two accompanying guardian angels. This comes from a Gemara in Tainus, where the Gemara says, "Tanar banu zman shisol shrim b'tzar per shachmed bain shnei malachei asher shemalavin leila adam manichin leidem oresh v'erim plain yizesh apirish ben asibar al yer ben achmas asibar." Essentially, that every person has two angels that accompany him or guard him, and when he dies, the person goes to heaven and they report everything he did. And when he's on earth, they also guard him. So each person has two guardian angels. What does he have to do before he goes into the bathroom? He has to say, "I'm sorry, angels, but you can't come into the bathroom. It's disrespectful for you to come into the bathroom with me." So he says, "Hitchabdu mechubadim, let me treat you with respect, O honorable ones, kedoshim, holy ones, mishartei elyon, those who service the Apai, tenu kavod, give honor leelokei Israel, to the God of Israel. Herfu mimeni, take leave of me until I go in and I do my business. And I will return to you." Amar Abaye responds to this, a person shouldn't say this. Why? Because it sounds like Dilma Shafki Levazli. It sounds like he's taking leave of them and they're going to leave him and not come back. Ela lema, rather a person should say a different formula. Shamruni, Shamruni, Azaruni, Azaruni, Samachuni, Samachuni, Hamtinu li, wait for me, Acha Kanes ve'etzei, until I come in and leave, Shekin, Darkan Shabnei Adam, because this is what humans have to do. Then the Gemara continues, what does the person say when he leaves? Kinafik, Omer Beracha of Asher Yatzar Adam b'chokma, u'varavon nekavim chalalim, or chalulim, galibi yadu lefnei kisei chodecha, she'im yiptecha echad mehem, o im yisatem echad mehem, efshar lamod lefanecha, ma'chatim, what should he finish the bracha with? Amar of Rav, one of the first century Amoraim says, Amar Rav, I'm sorry, I'm losing it. Rofei Cholim, Amar Shmuel said a different formula. He said, Kashavinu Abba Lukuli Alma Katsiri, you Abba Arich are making everybody sick. Ela Rofei Chol Basar, you should instead end the bracha, Baruch Atah Hashem Rofei Chol Basar. Rav Sheshet said, Mafli Lasot, the person should say Mafli Lasot, and therefore Amar of Papa says, let's paskin like both Shmuel and Rav Sheshes. Amar of Papa Hilkach Nemininu L'Tavayo Rofei Chol Basar Mafli Lasot. This is the source, this is the Gemara for how you say Asher Yatzar. First, Rav said that the closing should be Rofei, what was it? I'm sorry. Rofei Cholim. Shmuel says, no, let's not say Rofei Cholim. Let's say Rofei Kol Basar. Let's not call everybody sick. And then Rav Sheshes added Mafli Lasot, and therefore we say both. This is the Gemara that we have to see. Now, I'm going to take this Gemara step by step. We're first going to discuss the first part, the part about the angels, and then we're going to discuss the Asher Yatzar part. Okay, so first let's discuss the angel part. So this Gemara takes for granted that everybody has two guardian angels that accompany him wherever he goes. And again, as I said, it comes from this Gemara in Tainus, and it comes from many midrashim where it's an understanding in Chazal that every human being, when he walks through earth, has these two accompanying angels. We see this idea brought down much later also in the Kabbalistic circles when they created things like the Shalom Aleichem on Shabbos night. This is from another Gemara, which talks about when a person goes home on Friday night, he has these two angels that accompany him. So we see this idea in Chazal that people have ministering angels that follow them wherever they go. Now, today, nobody says this, but if you look in the early Paiskim, if you look in the early Sidurim, Rav Amram Gaon, Rav Sadia Gaon, the Rif, the Rambam, the Tur, the Orchot Chaim, they all bring a version of this. What's the version they bring? They bring as if this is, at least the Rav Sadia Gaon brings this as if this is normative practice, and as if everybody does this in the Middle Ages. And the Rambam brings it here as well. I'm just going to read it on the screen. Kodem sheikanes itchabedu mechubadim kedoshim mishartei elyon. Izruni, Shamruni, Haptinu li ache ikanes ve'etzei shezeh darkan shel bnei Adam. We have a hybrid formula, which is said as a mixture of the Brisa and Abaye, and where you tell them, yes, respectfully, O honorable ones, please watch me and stay at my side to help me and wait for me until I come out of the bathroom. Now, this group of Paiskim covers for us a wide geographical area. We have Egypt from Rav Sadia Gaon and the Rambam. We have Spain. We have Provence from the Orchot Chaim. We have Ashkenaz with the Torah and the Rush. It seems that in the Middle Ages, at least halachically speaking, this was the normative. This was the practice, the legal practice. This was halacha. People had to do this before going into the bathroom, and people did. The issue is that not always does what's in the Paiskim or in the halachic texts always portray reality. Not always what it says in the book is it what everybody actually does. For example, if you look in the Orchot Chaim, he doesn't bring this tefillah by Birchot HaShachar. He only brings it much later in a discussion next to Tfilat HaDerech. So you wonder, even if this was in the poskim, you actually wonder if people practically were doing this. If you fast forward a few hundred years to the 14th century, we have the Abu Dirham citing the Rivash that essentially people didn't do this anymore. The Abu Dirham was in Spain, the Rivash was Spanish, Algerian, and they said that simply people did not have the minhag to do this anymore. The Rivash gives a reason, and I'm pretty sure this is the Rivash. Nobody has actually said this for sure, but the Rivash, the Abu Dirham says Reish Beis Shin. So most scholars assume that's Rivash, but I'm not clear exactly who he's quoting. And he says that the reason a person shouldn't do this is because why shouldn't a person say this formula? Why shouldn't he take leave of the angels? He shouldn't do it because it's merci ki yuhara. It looks arrogant. It looks as if you're a holy person. Only holy people who can be sure that they have malachim escorting them around all day should say this. But regular people who might not have malachim escorting them around all day should not say this formula. So the question is exactly, like, what changed? Were people originally, was this a change that we're seeing in the 14th century? Or is it that people just never really said it? If you look to the sources, if you look back to Mamare Chazal, originally in the earlier texts of Chazal, in Mishnah, in early Braisais, in early Midrashim, the Tanoim rarely speak about Malachim in positive terms. They typically downplay the role that malachim have in our theology. For example, we say lo de malach v'lo de saraf, right? Ela Kadosh Baruch Hu ba'atzmo. We say in Haggadah Shel Pesach. The Tanaim in the early texts don't really talk so much about malachim. It seems that theologically they want to downplay the role that malachim have. And this there was a lot of an analysis of this history done by somebody named Mika Ahuvia from, I think, the University of Michigan. She did a lot of work on tracing the attitudes in Chazal about malachim. But later, in the time of the Amoraim, we find that the Chachamim seem to take for granted that angels were a part of everyday life. And they approach it a lot more seriously. And we cannot say, just looking at medieval writings, we can't say that in the medieval times people took angels any less seriously, especially with the Christians getting very into angelology at a certain point. You can't say that Jews were taking angelology or the study of angels not so seriously. So it's unclear to me why, if Chazal take this bracha seriously, at least in the Gemara, if the Chachamim take this bracha seriously, why did the bracha fade into obscurity? And that is Mika Huvia. So one theory that we could suggest is that it just got disused out of ignorance or laziness. People were either ignorant of the bracha or they got lazy, or the reverse happened. Not that people stopped caring about malachim, but people cared too much about malachim, and that people began to think that malachim were so transcendent, malachim were so holy, angels were such a holy thing, that it's impossible that low mortal men who were not exceptionally holy could have two administering angels or two guardian angels with him at all times. And therefore, people were refraining from saying it. Mind you, you cannot say that people stopped saying it for the reason the Rivash said, because the Rivash is saying no one should say it because it looks arrogant. But you can't say people stopped saying it because you can't say no one said it because no one says it besides tzaddikim, right? That's circular logic. You can't take the Rivash for a reason why people aren't saying it, but rather a reason why people shouldn't say it. So he's not giving an ideological reason. He's rather giving a recommendation. And the Rivash is saying, please don't say it in the 14th century in Spain. And for some reason, by the Middle Ages, people stopped saying it. And the Paiskim today, generally speaking, say that one does not have to say this formula. And this is a good example of what I was speaking about earlier, in the sense that I spoke about this a few shiurim ago. Not every tefillah that we find in the Gemara becomes part of halacha. Not every tefillah that is in the Gemara becomes something that everybody says. So we have to analyze not just the bracha itself, but also attitudes and history, and see what it is that we have to see what it is behind this bracha, and the wide gamut of context around this bracha that gives it survivability, not simply looking at the Gemara itself and saying this is the rule, this is the law, and this is what's going to happen, because that doesn't always pan out. We have to look at the bracha in context as well. All right, so one exception to this is very interesting. Everybody knows, not everybody, but most people know that the author of the Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Yosef Karo, famously had visions from an angel that he called the Magid. And there's a sefer called Magid Meisharim, which he wrote, which is his own notes with his discussions of this angel, which would give him visions and teach him Torah. It's called the Sefer Magid Meisharim. In Parshas Matot Maseh, where the angel is giving him Kabbalistic explanations of the parasha, Matot Maseh, the angel mentions to him personally that he or Yosef Karo should be very careful to only think in learning, to never speak words that are not essential for him to speak, and that if you do this, the Magid, will accompany you wherever you go. Me and my legions will accompany you wherever you go, besides for the bathroom. And before you go into the bathroom, let me just admit Ariel. And before you go into the bathroom, make sure to say Yischabdu Mechubadim. So we do see that that at least the Rabbi Yosef Karo believed that he himself should be saying Yischabdu Mechubadim, which is, he doesn't bring it in Shulchan Aruch that a person should say it, but he himself clearly was saying this prayer formula. So that's one of the last pieces of evidence we have for somebody saying Yischabdu Mechubadim in history. There was a rabbi also named, a conservative rabbi, I should say, Rabbi Dan Ornstein, who did some work on, some of the only work on Asher Yatzar. And he believes that this idea of angels shouldn't die. He believes that in a pastoral sense, if one is functioning as a clergy, as a chaplain, or in some form of rabbinical pastoral sense, that this could be very useful. Still teaching this Yischabdu Mechubadim thing, at least not academically, but pastorally, teaching this to people and giving them the encouragement that there are guardian angels can be very useful. And we shouldn't just discard it. We shouldn't just say these are old attitudes. People used to believe in angels. It can be very useful for people who are in suffering, people who are in pain, or people who are in distress. It can be very useful to speak to them in this sense that they do have guardian angels, so to speak, that were sent by Hashem to watch over them. And there's an imminent presence with instruments of Hashem there to guard over him. So he says, his point is, after reviewing Asher Yatzar, and going through the history of Asher Yatzar, his point is we shouldn't disregard it. Even if no one says this formula anymore, don't forget about this formula. This formula of Yischabdu Mechubadim Mishartei Elyon is still something that we should remember and take seriously. Let us move on. Okay, so let's move on to Asher Yatzar. So now, Asher Yatzar, the language that we saw was Ubarabo Nikavim Nikavim Chalulim Chalulim. Right? As we have spoken previously, a bracha doesn't come magically into existence. It's not just one fine day the Gemara wakes up and says, this is a bracha Asher Yatzar, I'm writing it, I'm making this up, and everybody should say this bracha. Typically, a bracha is born out of a context of creativity. There's multiple social groups of rabbis and other people creating prayer formulas for various things. And typically the most successful of these prayers are the ones that become canon. As we can see from the history of the Gemara itself that we just saw previously, we can see from that Gemara that the bracha was going through an area of development from the generation of the first Amoraim, from Rav and Shmuel, all the way down to the fourth generation with Rav Papa. So even in the Amoraic period, the girsa, the nusach of Asher Yatzar was not yet set in stone. So clearly, if from the first to the fourth generation of Amoraim, Asher Yatzar was still fluid, clearly it had not yet received its final form in the time of the Tanaim. And in truth, we don't see any reference to the bracha of Asher Yatzar in the works of the Tanaim. However, we do see parallel forms. We do see similar wording to this idea of Asher Yatzar in the early Tanaim. And here's the most famous example. This is a pasuk in Yecheskel Chavches, where Yecheskel is Hanavi, Ezekiel 28. Yecheskel is chastising the prince of Tyre, Negid Sur, for calling himself haughty, calling himself a god, and dismissing the supremacy of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So says Yecheskel, Be'eden gan Elokim hayita, kol even yikara mesuchatecha, odem pitida v'halom tarshish shoham v'yoshve sapir nofechu berakat v'zahav. Then Yecheskel says, Melechet tupecha unkuvecha bach biyom baracha konanu. I'm just going to read from the JPS translation here, which avoids the words we're actually trying to translate. You were an Ada in the garden of God. Every precious stone was your adornment: carnelian, chrysolite, and amethyst, beryl, lapis lazuli, and jasper, if I'm pronouncing those correctly, sapphire, turquoise, and emerald, and gold beautifully wrought for you. In other words, you, the Prince of Tyre, were trying to live on high. Mind for you prepared the day you were created. But the JPS is so unsure of what tupecha unkavecha means that they simply just try to skip over it. However, in the Targum, our Mesorah for what it means comes from the Targum. And Targum Yonasan ben Uziel gives us the following explanation. He says, Biski, okay, I don't want to do all of this, but let's go into Kol Ilain. I'm going to take my mouse here and point. Kol Ilain avidati kuncha bechen. All of these were done for you. Bechen, ra'em libach. Therefore, you became haughty. Beram la istakalt befigrach. Because you didn't look at your body a corpse, which is essentially a corpse. The ta'avid, which is made halalin unkavin, which is made with hollows and cavities. The inun sarchan, which you require. The la'afshar lach tititkayem lo, for which you cannot survive without. Miobadit barate imach mitaknin, from the day which we were created. A very similar language to what we have in Asher Yatzar. Nekavim, nekavim, chalulim, chalim, and we say, i'afshar lekem lefanecha. If it weren't for these nekavim and chalulim, it would be impossible for us to stand before Hashem. So the Targum Yonasan ben Uziel was undergoing development probably between the 1st and the 2nd centuries. The Gemara in Megillah tells us that the Targum on Nach was written by Yonasan ben Uziel, who's a Talmud of Hillel. He's a first generation Tana. We don't have any reason really to doubt this attribution of the Gemara, simply because if it's coming from the first, if we can tell academically for sure that it's coming from the 1st century, at least the 2nd century or 1st century, then we should have no reason to doubt the historicity of the Gemara when the Gemara tells us that Rav Yonasan ben Uziel was the one who wrote the Targum on Nach. But we do know for sure that this Targum of Yonasan ben Uziel was corrupted later in Bavel. Originally, it was written in pristine JPA, Jewish Palestinian Aramaic. Later, it got corrupted with a Babylonian Aramaic, and therefore we have it in its present form, which has corruptions, deletions, and additions. Regardless, this Targum, to leave the academic part aside, shows us that the Tanoim used this type of language without referencing Asher Yatzar before the 3rd century, where we have Rav and Shmuel discussing Asher Yatzar. So this form of language of nekavim, nekavim, chalulim, chalulim might have been a figure of speech. And the Ifshar lachlet itkayim might have also been a figure of speech already present in the time of the Tanaim. So that's a very beautiful thing to see that's so early. Now, just for fun, I will show you these magic bowls. This is something you could find online if you want to Google this yourself. The magic incantation bowls from Babylonia. Why am I showing you this? Well, for 2 reasons. Mostly for fun, but for 2 other reasons. First of all, there was an excavation in a place in southern Iraq called Nippur, which had a Jewish town. They found hundreds and thousands, hundreds really, but hundreds of Hebrew ones, but thousands of incantation bowls in this settlement. Many of them written in Hebrew, and these incantation bowls really should be called maybe goodwill bowls. These are eating bowls, which are used as like amulets. And when scholars of religion speak about magic or witchcraft or sorcery, they don't really use those words because those words pass judgment. They're thick concepts. If you say the word miracle, that assigns a value to something. Like if you say Moshe turned the stick into a snake and you say that's a miracle, you could also say that it's witchcraft or sorcery, right? If you use different words in English, that gives it a completely different judgment. So when they want to say a word which leaves the judgment out of it, scholars of religion use a word called thaumaturgy or thaumaturgical. And therefore, when discussing bowls like this, you could say they have a thaumaturgical quality, so to speak. Why? Because a lot of these bowls are written to ward off the evil eye. A lot of these bowls are written to prevent sorcerers and magicians from having any effect on you. And honestly, the Rabbanim weren't very much a fan of these kinds of amulets. The Jews who lived in southern Iraq were not the biggest Talmidei Chachamim, but this is what they used to do. And it's hysterical because it's so much fun. These drawings look like they were made by a kid. This is supposed to be a demon in the middle, which is, it's really like a schoolgirl making these little pictures of angels and demons. What's interesting about these bowls is that they show us two things. They show us, number one, in the 3rd century, the Jews in Babylonia, or in whatever you want to call it, in Bavel, thought about angels as being part of their everyday life. Because in many of these Hebrew incantations, they will speak to and call to the schus of angels to protect them. And as we spoke about earlier, they have in them what should I say? As we spoke about earlier, they have in the formula a notice that we consider angels to be accompanying us all the time. The second reason I'm bringing you these bowls is because on some of these incantation bowls, Professor Ahuvia, I think her name is, she looked at hundreds of these bowls to find that, besides in her research on angels, that a lot of these bowls have quotations from the Mishnah and from Rabbanim, but more so, many of them cite Targum Yonis and Ben Uziel. And what's fascinating about that is that it shows us that in the 3rd century, Targum Yonis and Ben Uziel was seen as an ancient and important text. So clearly, everybody in Bavel was familiar with Targum Yonis and Ben Uziel. And if there was a text in Targum Yonis and Ben Uziel, it would have gotten used. That's why I'm showing you these bowls, to show you two aspects of Asher Yatzar. First of all, they believed angels were part of their everyday life. Second of all, Targum Yonis and Ben Uziel was well known, even among people who were like this, people who were writing Kameh and amulet bowls. They still knew Targum Yonis and Ben Uziel. So clearly, something like that Targum would have had an effect on a bracha that was said later. The next thing we should look at, non-archaeological, is the text of Bereshis Rabbah right in the beginning of Bereshis Rabbah. This is another parallel text that's very similar to the forms that we have in Asher Yatzar. Our Gersa of Asher Yatzar is typically Nekavim, Nekavim, Chalulim, Chalulim, but there were also other Nuschaot, especially among the Temanim, which was Nekavim, Nekavim, Mechilim, Mechilim, which is the same, honestly, the same word. And it says here in the Medrash, Bereshis bara leikim, Rabbi Tanchuma, Pasach, Rabbi Tanchuma opened in being dirish the Pasach of Bereshis, Ki gadol ata ve'oisei neflois, Amar Rabbi Tanchum, hanoid hazeh im yeh bo nekev kechod shel machat, kol rucho yotzei mimenu. If you have this sack of air or gas or liquid, if you take this kind of a leather sack and you blow it up with air or liquid and you poke a hole in it, all of the air would come out. A person is made of many different hollow tubes, nekavim, and cavities, and never does his soul depart from him, or his breath. Only Hashem. The Midrash is saying that the wonders of creation include the creation of man, and how incredible it is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu could create a human where the soul rests within him. And this this medrash suggests to us very strongly that in the time of at least the 2nd or 3rd generation Tanaim, these languages of Nekavim, Chalulim, Chalulim was a turn of phrase that was very popular, and it's only natural that it would have come into Asher Yatzar. So one last thing here is the Gemara Brachas of Chavdal Amabez. This is in the time of the Moraim. We have, if a person passes gas in the middle of davening, here we have a person who needs to pass wind. A person who is standing and he's praying Shmon Esrei and he needs to pass wind. He backs up 4 cubits, and he passes wind, and he waits until he's done. And he starts praying again, but before he prays, he says this short formula: Ribono shel olam, Master of the universe. Yitzartenu nekavim, nekavim, chalulim, chalulim, galui v'yadu lefanecha, cherpatenu klimatenu b'chayenu. It is well known before you, God, you have created us with many cavities and hollows. It is well known before you our shame and our humiliation in our lives, ubachritenu, and when we die, rima v'tolea, that in our death we are also maggot and worm. So we see that in the time of the Amoraim, this kind of formula was also being transplanted to prayer, and therefore it's clear that Asher Yatzar was one of the one of the receivers of this donation. I'm trying to look for the English word for that, and it's just escaping my mind. One of the recipients of this turn of phrase, of this type of rabbinic language. Okay. So when did Asher Yatzar become a part of Birchas HaShachar? As far as we understand, Asher Yatzar is simply a prayer which you say when you leave the bathroom. It doesn't necessarily have to be in the beginning of a siddur. So how did it turn up in the beginning of every single siddur that you have? Let's just look at that history for a second. So if you look at all the early Paiskim, all the way as far back as of Sadian or Amram, they mention that people have this tendency to want to say all the brachot of Birkot HaShachar from Al Netilat Yadayim all the way until Ma'avir Chavlei Shena. They want to do them all in a series at shul. People don't seem to want to do it at home as they girdle their belt, as they do Netilat Yadayim. Why? It's not clear. It seems to have been a cultural thing. Perhaps in some people's houses, when they woke up in the morning, not everybody was appropriately dressed. They didn't want to say brachos at home. Perhaps in some cultures, people felt like prayer was only for shul. The private prayers weren't exactly, in vogue. But apparently in some places, instead of doing it at shul, people would do the Berachos HaShachar, at home, people would do the Berachos HaShachar at shul. This seems to be a Sephardi Ashkenaz split. Apparently in Sfarad, people would do it at home. In Ashkenaz, people would do it at shul. Some sort of cultural difference. In Egypt and Bavel or Sadegon reports that there were a minority of people who also wanted to do this at shul, and we don't protest. Okay. But what does that tell us about the history? That tells us that if people were going to wait until they got to shul, then this all became part of the same series. So you would wake up in the morning, you would wash your hands for Netilat Yadayim, you would go to the bathroom, you'd wash your hands Netilat Yadayim and Asher Yatzar for Netilat Yadayim and Asher Yatzar, but you wouldn't say on Netilat Yadayim or Asher Yatzar because you would want to wait till you get to shul. So because so many people waited until they got to shul to say those brachos, therefore they became considered as a part of the morning blessings, even though Asher Yatzar itself is not technically a morning blessing. One cannot say Asher Yatzar if he didn't go to the bathroom in the morning. And the Paiskim are adamant, like the Ramah says, a person should not say it twice. You can't just say it at home when you're saying, when you use the bathroom and then say it again over in shul just for liturgical purposes. You can't. Asher Yatzar is intrinsically tied to using the bathroom. So it seems, historically speaking, that for various cultural reasons, Asher Yatzar became a part of the liturgy series of the Berachot HaShachar, and it's stuck there in the beginning of the Siddur ever since. Now let's examine the internal problems of Asher Yatzar just for a few minutes, and then we will be relieved. So, as I said, Asher Yatzar is a kind of an awkward bracha to understand because externally it's a little awkward. Both where it's put in Talmud Bavli, it's put in kind of an awkward series, but it's also, it is also awkward internally. It is awkward in the sense that there's a lot of internal contradictions inside Asher Yatzar that the Mefarshim like plumbing. They like plumbing the depths of Asher Yatzar. And one of those contradictions is that we know in Bereshis, HaKadosh Baruch Hu created man, and there's two episodes of creation. In one of them, it says, Vayivra Elokim et Adam. And then it says, Vayitzer. I should have pulled up the language. I'm sorry. It's blanking on me because my brain is elsewhere. But first comes the episode of Bria, and then comes the episode of Yetzirah. And this is true in linguistic terms as well. First comes a full creation, right? A creation of form, and then comes a creation of matter, and then comes Yetzirah, which is a form to that matter. So why is it that Asher Yatzar begins Asher Yatzar ta'adam b'chokhmah uvaravo nekavim? It should be Asher bara ta'adam b'chokhmah, who created man with wisdom, and then Yatzar, and then he formed him with hollows and tubes and cavities. Why is it backwards? So for the purposes of tonight's year, I brought three possibilities. I know there are more, but I don't want to get into any strict homiletics for tonight. The first possibility is that it's not deliberate and that it's simply a coincidence. And why am I saying that? I know it's a little bit out of touch, but the truth is that if you look in the Talmud Yerushalmi, in the Gemara and Brachas, it's Perek Tes, Halacha Hey. In the standard editions of Talmud Yerushalmi, it just says Baruch Asher Yatzar Sa'adam. It doesn't give the entire girsa. But in the Vatican, the Ksav Yad Romi, as they call it in the Gemaras, in the Vatican edition, a Vatican Hebrew number 133, which I'm showing here on the screen, a facsimile of this Vatican edition, it says the full Girsa of Asher Yatzar. And what's the Girsa? Asher Yatzar ta'adam b'chokhmah ve'asita oto nekavim nekavim chalulim chalulim kininiyot kininiyot she'im mepatech echad mehen o yisatem echad mehen i afshar lachayot. In other words, a very similar language, but not as deliberate. And I should just explain, first of all, ve'asita, and you made him, nikavim, nikavim, right? Cavities, chalulim, chalulim, hollows. Kininiot is a very rare word. I didn't know what it meant. I looked it up in a fancy Hebrew, academic Hebrew dictionary, and they said kininiot means coils. So apparently it's some reference to the large intestine. And it says at the end, ifshar lachiot, the person will not be able to live if one of them opened or closed. Fascinating idea, but here clearly it doesn't say Yetzira and Bria. It just says Yetzira and Asiya. So perhaps if the Yerushalmi wasn't being deliberate in its terminology, maybe the Bavli wasn't either being deliberate in its terminology, and it technically is interchangeable. I'm not sure. I don't really subscribe to this view, but it is a possibility. The second possibility is that it's just a figure of speech. We know the pasuk says Yotzer or ubore choshech, oseh shalom ubore tovar ubore ra, I believe. Right. So the pasuk says that Hashem was Yotzer or ubore choshech. So clearly in biblical Hebrew, we first put Yetzira before Bria, and therefore here too in the bracha we put Yetzira before Bria. I don't find that satisfactory enough. I don't really like saying, oh, this is just the way they do it in Lashon HaKodesh. So what I found, the most satisfying answer I found was in the Siddur HaGrub in Nigel Benistar. It's a Kabbalistic Siddur. And over there, the Gras Talmidim explain what he's trying to say. And he basically compares Asher Yatzar to Yotzer Ar, the Beracha of Yatzar Ar. And he says the order over there of Yotzer Ar Borei Choshech is deliberate, because for Kabbalistic reasons, you're first discussing the Olam HaYetzira, from which the Olam HaSiyah comes, and then after that, you're going to describe the Olam HaBriya, which is included in the world of Yetzira under it and included in the world of Asiyah under it. In other words, technically speaking, Asher Yatzar comes from Chochmah of Asiyah, and then you rise up into Yetzira, and then you rise up into Bria. So there's a Kabbalistic reason for this. In other words, what he's trying to say is that there's a Kabbalistic reason for this. And he also mentions, why do we say Yotzer Ar, that you formed light? He says because light can take up space. At least, light has a form of represents spiritual energy that can take space. Choshech represents spiritual energy that doesn't take space; rather, it absorbs light, like dark matter does in quantum physics. Choshech can contain and withhold light. So he says we say Yotzer Ar because we have to form light, since it has a form of matter to it. It's a type of matter. But when we come to Choshech, which doesn't have any form, therefore you have to use the word of Bria. Bria is specific to things which cannot have a form. That's what the word Bria is used for. All right, so this lends perfectly into the next contradiction within Asher Yatzar, which is nekavim, nekavim, chalulim, chalulim. And all the Mefarshim asked, how could you say you're creating nekavim? You can't create a hole. A hole is a privation. It's a lack of thing. You can't create a hole. So many of the Mefarshim say, no, that's exactly what the word Bria is for. The word Bria is for something that has no form, something which you create out of nothing. Bria is the correct word for when you're creating a hole. Others say, well, it could mean that you're creating the tube and the cavity itself, what's surrounding it. It's not such a big kasha that's bara by nekavim nekavim. The Anaf Yosef goes so far to think this is such a strong kasha that he says, no, it might not be bara bo nekavim nekavim. It's borebo. Bore is from a pasuk in Yechezkel, means to pierce, and he pierced into a person hollows and tubes, which I find a little bit far-fetched, but it's still a very interesting reading of the bracha. Okay, the next thing of the bracha, which is very famous, is afilu sha'a echat. Everyone knows it says ef shalit afilu sha'a echat. So this would imply, afilu sha'a echat would imply that if any one of these hollows or tubes got punctured, a person wouldn't be able to survive even a moment. The commentators and even the Paiskim jump, and they're like, what is going on? How could the bracha say such a thing, that a person cannot survive even a moment? You have a nose and a mouth and you're surviving, and a person who gets a bullet shot can still survive. A person who gets stabbed can still survive. What do you mean a person can't survive for a moment? So some people answer that, of course, it doesn't mean a moment. It means even for a significant amount of time. It means, like, if a person had a a bullet through their head, it would be impossible for them to live for very long. That's the idea. It doesn't mean it literally. That's what some say. Some say that it's Kabbalistic, that it means that really the whole Asher Yatzar is referring to your spiritual body, the spiritual body which is on top of the physical body. And if one of those spiritual Ramach Ivarim or Shasagidim are penetrated or broken, it would be impossible for a person to live, and he would immediately perish. And some go so far as to say that the entire Asher Yatzar is not talking about a living person. It's talking about a fetus in the womb of a mother. If a fetus was exposed for even a second, it would die. I don't really know how to reconcile this with reality, because we don't say Asher Yatzar when a woman gives birth. We say Asher Yatzar when we leave the bathroom. So it's incredible how many of the Rishonim bring this pshat that it's talking about an uber b'mei imai. I never really understood it, but it's definitely worthy of investigation if the Rishonim bring it. Lastly, the bracha ends mafli la'asot, and God is wondrous in his creations. The Ramah says in Siman Vav that this is the wonder that the neshama stays inside the guf. Where does the Ramah get this from? Clearly, he gets this from the medrash that we said earlier about man nod zeh, right? The medrash said you take this leather balloon, you pierce a hole into it, and all the air goes out. But a person, he has many holes in him, and his ruach never leaves him. This is a really interesting thing philosophically, because anybody here who likes philosophy will be aware of the mind-body problem. The mind-body problem was a problem first thought developed in the 1600s by René Descartes, and really by his critics, where Descartes came along and said that consciousness and the body are made of different things, and they're completely incompatible. The characteristics of bodies and matter, of course, has spatial dimensions. They have they're linear. They can be measured right to left. They occupy space, and those are the characteristics of things that are physical. But the mind, its only characteristic is it's conscious. That's the only characteristic of a mind. You can't say that it has space, that it takes up space, and it goes and it has any a form or matter to it, and therefore these are completely separate things with separate characteristics. His critics came along and said, "How could you say that? How could you say that the mind is completely detached from the body? If you're going to say that the mind affects the body must have extension over the body. So if the mind has some sort of extension over the body, it must interact with the body, and therefore it must have some physical form to it. So the mind-body problem isn't that just that the mind and body are so separate, is that they are separate in a way that makes interaction between them impossible. And therefore, the mind-body problem is something that was conjured up first by philosophers in the 1600s, and it's a problem which nobody has fully resolved yet. How could consciousness be a part of you? How could consciousness be inside your body if really the mind or the experience of being conscious is not really bound to a body? This has some parallels in early philosophy of the soul being immortal, but never did earlier philosophers really discuss how does the soul stay with the body. This medrash seems to touch on this idea that the soul stays in the body. For the first time in theology, at least, this medrash, thousands of years, at least roughly 1600 years earlier, does discuss this problem, that it is a pele that the ruach of a person could stay in this body. Now, the mashal of the medrash is strange, because if the nimshal might be different, but the mashal does give a physical discussion where the air escapes. So too, a person has a physical body with so many holes, and his ruach or his air or his neshama never escapes. So clearly, there is some kind of idea in the medrash that the Tanoim believe that the soul does interact in the physical world within physical space. So this mafli lasois is a lot of food for thought. I encourage everybody to open a siddur that has mefarshim like the Eitzar HaTfilais or the Mesifta siddur, and to review all the beautiful pirushim on Asher Yatzar. Also, as well, to recognize how beautiful the message is of Asher Yatzar, that we have these internal innards, these internal organs, that we go about our typical day without thinking much. And we're so lucky. Healthy people are so lucky to not have to think about the mind-boggling complexity of the human body. It is only when people are sick that they first come to that loneliness, and they come to that terror and the rewriting of their entire narrative, when they have to rewrite who they are because they now have this illness and disease, and they have to come with a new terms to how they deal personally with their body, how they relate to themselves and how they relate to their body. and how they relate to health as well. So even if Moshe ben Mechir doesn't tell you that it's a segula, never said that it's a segula for staying healthy, clearly not taking your health for granted is a terrific exercise when we say Asher Yatzar. So thank you everybody for your time, for your attention, and Bezrat Hashem, we will continue next week with our discussion of Elokai Neshama. So I will pause the recording.